Welcome everyone to Talking About the Book. My name's Peter Schoppert. I'm director of NUS Press, and this is a kind of a regular series, a video series that we do highlighting recently published NUS Press books and stimulating conversations with the authors about those books, conversations between the authors, commentators, and readers. We're broadcasting live. This is my office at my cubicle at the NUS Press office. We're broadcasting live on YouTube and Facebook, and we'll take questions from the audience. If you join us on either of those channels, type your questions in the chat, and we'll be able to bring them on screen for our author and our respondents to speak to answer or comment on. Today's Talking About the Book session is a bit different in that it's produced in cooperation with the School of Media, Languages and Culture of the University of Nottingham, Malaysia, and that's a real pleasure for us to be working with the university. Today, we are talking about Celluloid Colony, Locating History and Ethnography in Early Dutch Colonial Film of Indonesia. There's the book, and with its author, Sandeep Ray. Before we begin, I thought it would be great to start off with some clips, a couple clips from the Dutch Film Archive. And what we've done is we've taken a couple clips that were edited together into a 1995 film called Mother Dow by Vincent Monnikendam, which in a way introduced Sandeep and many of us to the hidden treasures of the Dutch Film Archive. So as I said, to get started, to give us as only moving visual images can, a picture of the world as imagined in by the colonial state. Here's a clip from Mother Dow. So I hope that clip gives some sense of the rewards and dangers, the complexities, the layering, the emotion involved in trying to read and untangle a colonial film archive. It's a task that Sandeep has guided us through in his book with exemplary clarity and in a very inspired manner, I must say. So our format for talking about the book is quite simple. We'll try to keep it pretty informal. We have two distinguished commentators, Thomas Barker and Lisabona Rahman. They will first give some comments about the book, some thoughts about the book. We'll invite Sandeep to respond. Then perhaps some discussion between our two commentators and our author. And at that point, we'll see if we have any questions coming in from the audience, which we can introduce into the conversation. So let me first introduce Lisabona Rahman. She's an expert in film and moving image preservation. She studied image film preservation and presentation in Amsterdam, worked in Bologna at the leading restoration laboratory in Europe. She's a freelance consultant and programmer currently based in Berlin and a member of the Southeast Asian Pacific Audiovisual Archive Association, which I won't try to pronounce that acronym. Lisa, please.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to be talking about this book today. It was really an inspiration. And I simply just love how Sandeep writes. Yes, so I guess I will start sharing my impressions about the book. Again, thank you, Sandeep, for the research, most of all, and the book. It was really inspiring and exciting, especially, to look at audiovisual documents as primary source of historical research. I didn't even know, because I'm not a historian. I study more like preservation and archiving. I didn't even know that moving image was never considered as a primary source to historical research, which is a pity. And that is why I think Sandeep's argument is super important, because the amount of documents of audiovisual document like films that have been produced during human civilization is simply immense. And we, as archivists, keep making like new discoveries, new findings every single day of past records. So it would be a loss actually if this cannot be considered as primary source of historical research. And nonfiction films in itself is yet another huge category left quite unexplored, especially in our region, Southeast Asia. And this category, I believe, will tell us a lot about colonial way of working, of gazing, and something that we still struggle to overcome, like even today. But we must try, and I feel that this research that Sandeep did and the publication of this book is a step closer towards this critical look and thinking about coloniality and gazing. Yes. And another thing I would like to point out is that the films are important as records because they were part of like this huge machinery of colonial power. As one of the experts on Dutch colonial film, Nico de Clercq, pointed out, this enterprise of recording in film what was the colony like, and how the colonial power was managing the colony was indeed a large enterprise that involved making thousands of films. And apparently it was also not only the making that was a big enterprise, but also how it was distributed, the screening, how the films were shown to the public, both in the colony and outside of the colony, to justify the idea of colonialism. And I think as a filmmaker, Sandeep has the advantage of this methodical understanding of how a film is made, and therefore his reading of nonfiction films in this book is also very meticulous, like shot by shot breakdown, and how he reads into or reconstruct rather how a shot would have been made. And this adds I think a very important credibility to this research. And the next point I would like to say, like, as much as films I mean, we know that film is a recording medium, but I think the truth that that a film is able to carry or to record is often I would say underestimated, and this is actually quite ironic because film is the especially early films, yeah, that was made before 1920, let's say in the teen years of the 20th century, were considered too raw, too real, as it was very close to just recording events and not storytelling as filmmakers from the 20th century would master later after the 20s. And so there is an irony that I think is captured very well in this book, that, you know, film sits somewhere in between for historical researchers. It is somehow deemed not truthful enough, or not credible enough as source of the truth, whereas for the film scene, like the art of filmmaking scene, it is considered too close to the truth, like the early films, and therefore not to be taken seriously as an artistic practice. But I think it is telling, yeah, that especially through Sandeep's research, we can see, and with this, Sandeep, please also show us a few clips that you have, that, you know, by decoding and exposing how these films are made and how it should be read or could be read further, I think you also show this real and unreal position of each film, that a film can never be just real or just a record or something, because it is limited by its medium, and it is further interfered by its editing. But even then, because by nature it is a recording material, then there are, of course, some truth, even unique truth, if you will, that is recorded on film. And so in this in-between position, I think, interestingly, and I would like to quote the quote that Sandeep used in this book, and I think it is very important to remember this, is a quote from Tom Gunning, an expert in early cinema, that early cinema, exactly because of its so-called raw quality of recording and editing, is actually showing us the voyeurism, and I quote, "The voyeurism implicit in the tourist, the colonialist, the filmmaker, and the spectator is laid bare in these films without naturalization of dramatic structure or political argument." So I think it's a very well-chosen point that also, for me, is the soul of this whole book, is how is the proposition of how to use and understand and deal with the records that come from audiovisual recording. And I want to move more specifically to the part in this book which I really, really find very interesting, and it even inspired me to do like further research about the technological development of filmmaking in Flores at that time. It is the chapter on Flores films. Sandeep, if you could show us also some clips from the Flores films, that would be fantastic. Yes. So this special chapter is super interesting because it's not films made by professional filmmakers, but rather it's made by priests turned filmmakers. And when I say turned filmmakers, it is really serious because these priests. Can you can you get rid of the control panel, please? Thank you. Yes. So when I say priests turned filmmakers, it is really serious because these priests are really sent to the United States to learn the techniques and even arts of filmmaking in order to be able to incorporate, filmmaking to their evangelization work. And I think it is very interesting that Sandeep did a very thorough research on these films made in the island of Flores, where this special order of Catholic priests, the SVD, was using films to make a statement about their work, their good work in Flores, and also at the same time keeping a certain control in truth making about Flores as the geographical location of their work. And they explored like different genre in their work, right? I don't know if you could also show a little bit of their travel film, the first one, Flores film, and later they move into something a little bit like hybrid filmmaking, what we probably know much more from what Flaherty has practiced, and also later, although from the ideological spectrum, like very different, also what was practiced by the neorealist filmmakers after World War II. So I think in the chapter about Flores films, I think there was also sufficient details to offer ways of reading, of how to read this fictionalized reconstruction, even though it's based on true story, but it is still not the happening in itself, but reconstructed. And what was also real about the pictures that we see, like for example, locations are real, and a lot of elements that people have, for example, what people wear, or the kind of rituals that people were performing were real. And if you watch Riarago, there is also, there are two versions of Riarago. One is silent, and the other one was screened accompanied by music that was recorded by ethnomusicologist Siap Kunst around the archipelago of what they called the Sunda Kecil, Little Sunda. And so all in all, like the sum of not only what is recorded in the film, but also its performance were always sitting between record, like ethnographical record, and fiction, of course, or political statements. And I feel that it is also interesting that in these books, Sandeep, we're not only talking about audiovisual material as record, but also as event, especially in the part of the Flores film. He was also accounting for one very interesting event, which was the screening of the the films made in Flores to the audience in Manggarai in the occasion of the coronation of a young king. And I would like to quote a little bit of sentence that Sandeep wrote about this. It's yeah, so Father Boyce was making history in Flores, probably screening a film to the largest early audience that has ever assembled in the East Indies. So he was screening the film of Riarago and Flores film in 1930 on the eve of coronation of Raja Alexander Baruk. And so Raja Alexander Baruk was supposedly the first Christian Raja of Manggarai after the long reign of a Muslim king or non-Christian kings in Manggarai. So this coronation of Raja Alexander Baruk was obviously a victory for Christian evangelists, and therefore this coronation in itself is a big event for the church as much as for the villagers. And one of the celebration that happened during this coronation was what we call in Indonesia nowadays layar tancap. So basically a screening, an outdoor screening to a big amount of people of a film. And in this book, Sandeep recorded that the film was seen by 4,000 villagers. And yes, and this is a photo that was published in the newspaper on the account of that day, that coronation, where Father Bais was congratulating the young Raja. And so the account was that the film apparently was screened to 4,000 villagers and 38 village heads. And it could easily be the biggest number of audience. Although my question would be, like, how was it even projected? Like, 4,000 is immense amount of audience, right? And even for today's standard, projecting for 4,000 audience is really quite a gigantic undertaking. So it'd be very interesting to research more about, you know, the technical aspects of how this projection was done, and therefore also understand like how that projection was incorporated into the life of the villagers in Manggarai at that time. Yes, and my last point would be again about I want to come back to my initial point about film as historical, the primary source of historical research. And here I again want to quote what Sandeep has written, is that the idea that film footage, especially overt propaganda material, could serve as unique evidence was one whose time had not yet come. He was, of course, speaking about the previous historical researchers who apparently didn't find a way to take film seriously as primary source of material. And I cannot agree more with this statement. I mean, as an archivist, each day I would engage with historical record, albeit with nonfiction films or fiction films. And yes, audiovisual records definitely can paint 1,000 words, but we also need to take into account that the development of the technology of film playback or watching films nowadays is already evolving in such a different way to how films were played back and viewed as analog, in analog times as celluloid reels. So in projector or editing table, it is less easy to go forward, rewind, stop for a long time, and therefore the possibilities of reading with analog playback technology was very different than what is possible today. So I would conclude my comment by saying that I believe that Sandeep's argument and also methodology is very much the sign of our time today, like where the development of playback technology as such that it is now possible to look more meticulously into audiovisual document, and therefore this has enabled the formulation of Sandeep's argument in this book. And therefore, I would like to thank you again, Sandeep, for this hard work. And I also want to say, again, thank you for sharing all the fun and excitement in your journey. And, for those of you who are interested about not only moving image history, but also the East Indies, you should definitely look into this book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Very gracefully done. The introduction to helping us think film as a record, as storytelling, and as event, and an amazing, the Flores clips just highlighting how strong was the pull of storytelling once the language and the ability of using film to tell stories was developed. So much to talk about, but let's move on to our next commentator, and we'll be interacting soon, I promise. Thomas Barker is currently an honorary associate professor at the Humanities Research School at the Australian National University. He's a former head of school at Nottingham, Malaysia, where he taught for 9 years. And he's also the author of Indonesian Cinema After the New Order, Going Mainstream. Thomas, your thoughts on the book?
I think I need to unmute. Thanks so much, Peter. And thanks to NUS Press for hosting us this evening. And thanks to Lisa for getting up so early in Berlin. We've both been asked to comment on the book, and I'm actually reading the book for the third time after having read it over Christmas at the beach, and then again for a book review, and for a third time for this discussion this afternoon. And keep finding new things in the book that I miss and then come back to, and all these little bits of information and threads that Sandeep puts in for the reader that as Lisa says, provoke us to kind of go back and explore these kinds of threads and open up new possibilities for research around things such as exhibition, as Lisabona mentioned, but also the history of cinema, the documentary film practice, the links between the Netherlands and what was then the Dutch East Indies during that colonial period. I guess for myself too, the book really puts into perspective this film that I came across many years ago on, I think probably archive.org, made by the Goodyear Rubber Company, called Sumatra, the Island of Yesterday, I think it's called. You can find it, it's free to watch. And I was always kind of fascinated by this colonial document made by an American rubber tire company, and its kind of place within both Indonesian economic and colonial history, but also within film history. It appears that Sandeep has a clip from that particular film. This one is a kind of classic, kind of exotic Orientalist travelogue, as we kind of follow the camera through different parts of life in Sumatra and different forms of kind of cultural activity here, some kind of gamelan, dancing, etc. But yeah, Sandeep's book, if you're interested in this period of colonial history and the filmmaking that was going on, and the stories being told about the colony, both back to the colony, but also back to the motherland or the colonial homeland, for example, it is through these kinds of films that we see this activity happening. But I guess I'll make 3 points kind of broadly here, and I think we'll talk to Sandeep and perhaps Lisa and I can talk a bit more about digital resources and digital scholarship towards the end as well. But the 3 points I'd like to make, and I think Sandeep's book really kind of brings these out, is the following. The first is that these Dutch colonial documentaries are what we might kind of consider as a bit of a forgotten corner of film history. Those of us who read the history of documentary film often talk about people such as Robert Flattery and Nanu Gwila North. We talk about British documentary, especially in the 1920s and 30s, with the British documentary film movement. And we often think about this period of documentary as being, especially leading up to World War II, as being also the emergence of forms of propaganda. But what I think Sandeep shows us here is that there was this another corner of documentary filmmaking that has really been kind of undiscovered until now in many ways. And I think the book brings it together really nicely, telling the story of this period from 1912 to about 1930, about this kind of forgotten corner of documentary film history. But it is also in many ways a corner of film history that's been forgotten because it is Dutch and not English or American, as the two leading kind of sources of cinema and the places where we think kind of documentary and cinema really centers around during this period. It's also colonial, which is, of course, politically problematic, and there's a whole history there that can be unpacked around colonial relationships and the gaze and the viewpoint and the purpose of these documentaries. But also the genre of documentary itself. A lot of film history has also focused on feature film and fiction film rather than documentary, and so this little corner of film has been in many ways neglected and forgotten. And I encourage people to read the book just to kind of read about this period of history, this little corner of film history that has been uncovered here. The second point to make also is around Indonesian film history. There is, I guess, a bit also in the history of film and cinema in Indonesia itself, especially as it has been written to date. There has been a tendency to dismiss this period prior to 1950 as not really being a formative part of Indonesian film history. But I think this Dutch colonial documentary, even though it is in many ways within the framework of the colonial system and all the politics that go with it, and of course the very important moment of Indonesian independence in through the late 40s and 1950, it is still kind of very much a part of Indonesian film history that builds up until the 1950s, is really when the new kind of independence film movement gets going. But I think what we can also see, if you get the chance to watch documentaries made during the New Order, for example, so from 1966 to 1998, you'll see echoes of this kind of documentary form of the documentary that tries to promote forms of health, inoculation, that tries to talk about transmigration. I remember in high school when I was learning Indonesian that we watched a documentary film about transmigration made in the New Order. And we see very similar, I think, themes emerging from in these documentary films made in the Dutch period to the New Order period, where we can in some ways see an interesting kind of political continuation going on as well. So I think there's some interesting echoes as well. So the history is not simply cut off in 45 or 50, but is much more continuous, especially in film. And I think also the themes in the documentaries, we saw some clips earlier from of children in the tobacco plantations, and we have echoes therefore of similar extractive resource industries that we understand in Indonesia today, such as palm oil or other cash crops, land clearing, these kinds of things. So some of the themes actually of the Dutch colonial documentaries that we see, the economic activity, have their continuations till today as well. And the third point to make too is about what we might call the kind of unique vision of these films that Sandeep makes the point of noting in the book as well. That in many ways, these were films made by amateur filmmakers, often not professionals. There is the case of a professional filmmaker whose name eludes me for the moment, but who makes a number of films. But the first kind of examples, and Sandeep may talk about this, of the filmmakers who come to the Dutch East Indies to film are not, filmmakers. They are, the first guy, Lamster, forgive the pronunciation, is a kind of former soldier who comes to make documentary film. And in many ways, we get these films, and this enables Sandeep's kind of reading of the films too as ethnographic texts, is because the filmmakers are perhaps less trained or less skilled in the art of visual filmmaking, of the editing and really producing a slick documentary and making films that are much more revealing of the time and the place in which they were made. And we can really see the films, therefore, kind of operating in their historical period, their historical moment in which they were made. We could look back on them now as being examples of the colonial enterprise, of exploitation, of forms of subjugation, and forms of power relations as well. But being made at the time through the vision of the time, we get an insight into that kind of colonial viewpoint, that colonial vision as well. So that would be my kind of 3 points. I have a few more to make, but I'm happy to turn it over to discussion, and we can talk about some more points, answer questions as they come in.
Terrific, Thomas. Thank you very much, pointing out the continuities and also the way that the films, helped by Sandeep's reading, reveal the conditions of their production in interesting ways. Sandeep, you've been the subject of our conversation for a long time. We're about to let you respond to these comments. For the audience who hasn't met Sandeep yet, he's a writer, as well as a filmmaker, as well as a historian and university teacher. He's associate professor at the School of Media, Languages and Cultures at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. And, you've been hearing about his book. I'm happy to say that it was a finalist for the Eurosys Social Science Book Award this year as well. Sandeep, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me clearly. All right, thank you to the two discussants, Lisabona and Thomas, for tuning in from Berlin and from Canberra. So that was really nice. Now let me first quickly address some of the issues raised in this conversation. The first thing I want to touch on is the work of archivists, as Lisabona raised, and is one herself, right? Now the beautiful thing about archivists is that they will archive something no matter what, often, right? They will not necessarily look at the immediate practicality of something. They will just say it's there. Let's put the metadata. Let's tag it. Let's write down. Let's watch it. Let's screen it, and let's do it, which is such a blessing, because by the time my time came to look at these films, the work had been done. I don't want anyone to get the impression that I did some, unusual path-breaking work in finding these films. No, it was done. I went to the Netherlands, I went to the Eye Institute and to Beeld and Cloud in Hilversum, and lo and behold, it was there. Everything was there. Now, it wasn't, utilized very well, I think, but step one, the work was done. Same, decades earlier, and even when the films were made, somebody stored them, somebody wrote about them, somebody entered them meticulously. So we stand on the shoulders of people who archive things, right? Photographs, films, books, what have you. Without that, there is nothing. There is nothing. Archivists have gotten a bad rap off lately, I think, since Derrida came out with archive fever and all these critical questions about archives were raised. Sure, there's a lot of omission. There's a lot that's, not done. But, I think the time has come to celebrate the work that has been done, okay? We've criticized archives enough. Okay, so I'm gonna go into this question of the colonial way of gazing, okay? Because obviously, when you look at these films, they're disturbing because they're taken by colonial people working at the behest of colonial rule, right? Rulers, right? And they had specific jobs. Go and make a film about the plantation. Go and film the celebrations in the Kraton. Go and film, something that's happening in Bali, etc. Now, something that Nico de Klerk said, and Lisabona referenced him earlier this afternoon, he said this one very simple sentence: colonial filmmaking can't be colonial all the time, right? You can't expect a camera person to go behind the camera and say, I'm a colonialist. What do I see? What do I film? It doesn't necessarily work like that. And so I think some of the richness of the material does come from, the colonial gaze. Yes, that's there and that's easy for us to pick on, but there's a lot more to it than that. And that's why it shouldn't be dismissed as colonial films, which I think people have done quite a bit, right? So now the question comes down to, so why Dutch cinema or Dutch colonial films? Have we not had enough of colonial films? And Thomas also raised the question about the forgotten corner, right? And I'll try to give you some reasons as to why I thought it was worth the deep dive. So yes, there are British colonial films that we've seen. Colonialfilm.org is a fantastic website. Every film has been studied and analyzed and written about, etc. We've seen French colonial films. Certainly, any European power that has a colony has made colonial films. Of course, they have. But the Dutch, I think, were different in certain ways. First of all, if you look at a lot of these British colonial films, and I'll just use Britain as an example for now, they're newsreely, or they go into a very standard documentary format. In the trade, we call it the Griersonian way of making films, which lasted decades after the end of colonial rule. You have a narrator, they have a very specific subject. They usually pick one or two people or a location, and they make that the center of the film. And they talk around it, and that's your documentary film. And this was the way in which a lot of films were made. Now, what I think happened, and I've corroborated this with other sources, and I'm not going to go into all of that now, is that this style of documentary filmmaking came around because of World War I, right? You suddenly required telling a story. You required a nation that had to be saved, a nation that had to be defended, a moral position. And you started putting, these narratives as the film, otherwise people wouldn't watch them and people wouldn't rally around them. Now, as you know, the Netherlands was famously, I'm looking for a little poster here, which, let's see if I can find it. Okay, I'll come back to it later. It was famously neutral during World War I, okay? And I think that's part of the reason why filmmaking in the Netherlands actually didn't change very much. It's because they didn't immediately go into this style of filmmaking. And so what was referenced a little while earlier as sort of maybe amateurish, maybe slow, etc., I think is what gave it this deeper ethnographic content, because they didn't have a point to prove necessarily about putting someone in the middle of the film. So slower films, longer films, films that cover subjects without championing one person, many films, right? That was the other things. I mean, an extraordinary amount of filmmaking, more so than the British did, right? And I think this is why it stands out as a style or as a category to study. And that's why I think it was worth it, right? Okay. Lisabona brings up the question of the influence of Robert Flaherty onto those missionary filmmakers who made those quasi-fictional, I think the fancy term for it is ethno-fiction, right? By going to the location and finding local actors and building a story around them. And other scholars like Eddie Apples has also said, well, were they influenced by Flaherty's Nanook of the North because he sort of did the same way with the Inuit people. Now, this is where I think there might be another answer to this, that the inspiration may or may not have come from Flaherty. I mean, we don't know, we can't dismiss this, but I think I have another point of view here. And let me play a quick clip for you while I talk about this, okay? Just give me 1 second, okay? 1 second, share screen, window. Okay, here we go, okay. So I hope you can see this. Right. Now, this is a film that was made as part of not a finished film really, but just like an impressions film called Bali Floating. And it was made by a camera person called Willie Rack. And they recreate the scene where there is a young woman who is unwilling to be married to someone that they've chosen for her. And so they forcibly bring her over and they exchange betel leaf and coins, and they actually trap her in a trap that doesn't look very convincing. And you can see that she turns away. She doesn't want to have anything to do with this. She's upset by this, and you see they're picking up that trap, right? And they're putting that on. Now, this stuff happened. Willie Rack would not have seen Flaherty's Nanook of the North when he filmed this, right? And this is what inspired, I think, Simon Bowes, the priest who made Ria Rago, which became a very, very famous film, and we played clips of it earlier, to find local actors and reenact what they thought were, socially, unconscionable behavior by people in the Highlands. The whole issue was that these people lived in the Highlands in Flores, and there was almost a race for Islamists and the missionaries to get to them, to bring them into a monotheistic religion. And so they would make these films to say, look, this is why they need to be saved. This is classic missionary stuff, right? And so that's really my point, is that we shouldn't assume that there is an Anglophone influence into the Dutch colonial film way of doing things. In fact, they stayed out of the Anglophone world, which is why the films are so different. They didn't make films in the way Flaherty was making for the longest time. And that's another reason why I think it was worth studying, and that's why we're talking about a forgotten corner. So in a way, I'm in an awkward position. I don't want to glorify colonial filmmaking, but at the same time, I cannot not feel that some of these filmmakers were extraordinary. I mean, Thomas Barker raised the point that some of them may have been amateur filmmakers. Certainly Lamster, the first filmmaker, was, even though he did some very, very interesting work. And I'll share a screen with you quickly as I speak over it. Here we go. Sorry, cancel. Give me 1 second. Ha ha ha. Right, here we go. Okay. So this is an example of something that would be considered, say, a quote-unquote amateur film. Why are we calling this an amateur film? Because it's filmed in 1911. It's a wide shot, right? And you have a very special celebration in the Kraton in Yogyakarta, where the Dutch resident actually takes the arm of the Sultan of Yogyakarta, Pakubuwono, and it's sort of a tradition that held on for a long time. But I think this perfectly stands up fine, as an ethnographic film. In fact, there are babads written about this very ceremony without a visual corroborative element to it, and the film gives us that. Now, Lamster was, relatively speaking, although he picked up quickly, amateur filmmaker. Fair enough. But some of the people who came after that, Willie Mullins, one of the finest filmmakers of Amsterdam, of the Netherlands. In fact, he did make the film about how the Netherlands was neutral during World War I. Isador Oksha, who was a great camera person, and Willy Rack, who filmed up in Flores, among other people. Now, again, it puts one into that awkward situation of expressing admiration for Dutch colonial filmmakers, but sometimes you cannot help yourself kind of look at it as a craft and say that given what we have today, it's because these people went to far-flung corners and actually put the camera up and filmed these places, that there is a record of it, right? I mean, it was impossible to develop film in those days. You had to go, you had to be cold, it had to be done between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning. Lisabona has this in her essay on filmindonesia.id about how this work was done. And this perseverance gives us this exhaustive archive today, right? So we have to look at it for what it's worth for. There's no point judging that sort of thing at this vantage point. After 2 world wars, the films have all survived. We're in 2022. And because of what we just mentioned, this sort of extraordinary resilience of what's becoming the digital archive, you can do something as that you couldn't ever do before, which is look at this. I mean, this is anybody's handphone, right? You can go into that, you can watch these films regardless of where you are in the world. When I started out, we didn't have this yet. This happened in the last 4 years. The I Institute put out their entire archive, as did Build and Cloud. I used to watch the films on MPEG files, which they were very generous with, and they gave me for research. And I wrote my book based on that and going back and forth. But now it's over there. So if you read my book and you want to watch these films, they're all there. It's not mysterious anymore. It would be strange for anyone to teach late colonial era history and actually not sort of reference these films, especially if you're studying Indonesia or if you're even looking at film studies, okay? I think I'm going to stop my part here, and maybe we can have a discussion about this. Thank you.
Excellent, Sandeep, and welcome back, Lisabona and Thomas. Really, the floor is open. I think it's a great appreciation of Sandeep's work and of the films themselves. Does anyone want to come back at any of the points Sandeep made? Do you want to judge the colonial film? Any points you'd like to make? Yeah.
If I may, yes, I want to answer to exactly that point. I think the more interesting question here is not about judging colonial films whether they're good or bad, right? It's more, I mean, and I take this from the spirit of how and Laura Stoller have read the colonial archive. It's more the question of how they made the films, because making films in the tropical country, even today, is challenging. But back then, it's even more challenging. As Sandeep brought up, I wrote an entire article just to chronicle how Father Boyce set up his own DIY lab in Flores, which is probably like the predecessor of all artisan lab in Southeast Asia of today, probably. So we cannot take it very lightly as, not only if I can say it's aesthetic endeavor, but it's also as technological infrastructure and endeavor. It is something very serious. I think too serious to be only judged, about whether or not it's good or bad, but more, I think it's worth looking more into why and how, what is being depicted, and why, for example, professional filmmakers like Willy Mullens sent more to the richer part of the colony, Java, where the plantation is more like full-fledged, whereas for like less rich area like Flores, either amateur filmmakers like Pater Boyce was working, or ethnographers. I think you brought us into this question, like maybe not always willingly, but as I was reading this book, I was really wondering, like, why certain people is at a certain place, in the archipelago, and when. So, yeah, I think you basically started this spiral of, of understanding the late colonial film.
Yep.
Thomas, I wondered if you had a response to Sandeep's rather grand hypothesis about the different narrative structure of Dutch colonial film, not having had that development during the war.
No, I actually think that's one of the great, like it's one of the key arguments of the book, and I think I don't see any reason not to follow Sandeep's reasoning and argument. Actually, I think it's actually really kind of interesting that that in many ways that there is this, that the Dutch colonial documentary branches off what we kind of typically see as maybe the mainstream history of documentary filmmaking, of between the World War kind of propaganda film. And I think it seems reasonable to me as an argument. It's great. So and I think it opens up, therefore, like a whole series of observations that can be made, and enables, as Sandeep says, the way of then reading the films in a different way as well, that they're not they're not as kind of produced in this kind of structured way with a certain narrative and a central character and so on and so forth. Some maybe, yes, but many of them not. So I think it's a perfectly I think it's actually it's a great argument. And that's one of the things I picked up early in reading the book too. That I was like, yeah, this is great. But maybe can I go back to an argument, or back to a thing, Peter? If we don't have any questions, maybe we do. But yeah, maybe we can talk a bit more about archives and the digital resources as well. I'll make a quick point, and then we can go to some questions. I think as Sandeep kind of mentions, and for young researchers too, and even in current research I'm doing, that the availability of digital archives now of newspapers, in my case, really open up, ways of searching and finding information unavailable to us previously. So the digitization, and also the text searching that's now available on newspapers, such as through the Singapore Newspapers Archive, the National Archive, or the National Library in Indonesia has a project. Monash University in Melbourne also has a whole set of documents online. It's really amazing the kinds of now access we have to this material.
Oh yeah.
Yes, can I twin that point with Lisabona's question about who was where and why? Just to put that back to Sandeep. I mean, how much more scope is there for investigating those questions? I mean, how much do you feel we can still find in the archive to dig deeper into the hows of how these films were created? Please tell us that you've left some work for some others in these matters.
No, I mean, I don't think there's, you know, there's only so many questions you can ask, I think, about the process. But I think there's so much material that somebody who's far more knowledgeable than me about those events, historical events that were on film, could actually go in and work on that, and or even, you know, I could, but it would take more studies. I mean, I've just written a paper about the first film made on the Hajj. It was made in 1926, and you know, I had to. This is something Lisabona is, you know, much more used to doing, literally watching something for frame by frame for a long time and saying, okay, what town is that? Why are the women not wearing headscarves, you know, in 1926, and they're going to Hajj? Does that mean something? What's happening on the ship? They're being buried. Is that a sea burial? You know, what does the Quran say about sea burial? You know, things like that. Like, you can watch, you know, something that has been documented just in the way that you would read a newspaper source or a diary or any entry. It's just, you know, just treat it as a primary source, and then see what kind of research that can come out of it. I mean, the structuring of it, the gaze, the way in which it's put together, I mean, I don't think there's that much really to, you know, I mean, we can conjecture, we can talk about things, but there's that sort of stuff. I mean, to Thomas's observation that, you know, there's this sense of when we look at something that, you know, we can go into a deep dive of the archives now, is absolutely true. I mean, you know, I'll just, you know, quickly share just a window of the kinds of things, it's still in beta, but of the kinds of things that I would look at, right? So here we have, you know, a film made, if you can you see that window now on screen? Okay, so for example, so here, you know, here you have a poster made about a film. Here you have a project going on in KLTIV. Here we have, you know, a reference to Battle of Algiers. These are, you know, newspaper sources that we can, you know, use. You can clearly see I've used, you know, keywords and gone into newspapers. You can find old posters. We can look at contemporary museum exhibitions. You can look at a book that was written by Lamster. You can look at other people who've written about the Aceh War. You could find a book that was written in 1903 that critiqued the entire, you know, process of exploitation on the plantations, you know, long after the, you know, Multatuli wrote that in 1987, in 1880-ish, right? Yeah, something like that. You know, you can look at the other films. You can, I guess what I'm saying is all of this material, you know, can now be sort of put together, looked at when you're considering making, you know, writing a book or writing a project, and you can make all of these connections that all the scholars have made because they're moving digitally, because they're coming into your space. So the archive, instead of being one repository where everybody points to, is actually now a neural system, right? Right. And it's very, the ways of access are very different. We are constantly remaking our archives, our own archives, and adding to things. Does it make things harder to keep track of? Yes. Does it mean that we have so much more available and so much more conversation going on right at the same time? Yes. So the way in which we think and write has changed. And again, this has not happened too much longer than in the last decade, I think.
And the way we publish has to change as well. So this is a puzzle for NUS Press. A quick advertisement for our epress.nus.edu.sg, where we have a visual archive, for example, to support Heather Sutherland's book on the history of the Eastern Archipelagos. Sort of a middle layer above the visual archives. Harry Puzey of KITLV writes about the post-Delfer history writing, Dutch history writing, Delfer being the huge database of
Yeah,
printed
yeah,
sources
yeah.
that's made available. It really changes everything. We've run way over time, but I'm having a lot of fun. I hope you are. We do have one question that's come in. It's rather a long one, but let me try to summarize it. It refers to this idea of the, well, there it is, nicely summarized.
Explain further the relationship with Gunning's idea and or with cinema of attractions. What does cinema of attractions mean?
This switch from the cinema of attractions of showing events which are impressive, and then to the cinema of storytelling. Do you see how do you see that in the archive? Perhaps I think Lisabona, you brought it up right in your comments. Yeah.
Maybe you want to take a stab at it, Lisabona, while I wrap my head around this question.
I think it was really interesting that you brought in Gunning into this part of the book where you basically position non-fiction filmmaking in a place where no one really believes that it's real enough, but it's not taken too seriously as an art form, and therefore it doesn't seem sophisticated enough as a fiction. I think that's where you position Tom Gunning's statement. That although Tom Gunning says if we try to look and take it as what it is, we could see the voyeurism, basically how people think at that time. So
yeah.
Let's take it further from there.
Oh, okay. I mean, this is not to suggest that there was a unqualified innocence about those early nonfiction films. I mean, you're still bringing together people in a room or outdoors when conditions may not permit you to film, at night or something. And there is a certain staginess to early nonfiction film as well. Film was expensive and very difficult to process, so I think people were very meticulous in what they were filming, not like today where you let the camcorder run and you say, let's find life on the street sort of a thing. I mean, you had to be very, very clear because you're spending a lot of money doing this sort of thing. But at the same time, I suppose it's not quite the same as the cinema of attractions, as the reader says, because who watched these films? They were very clearly made for mostly the young men in the Netherlands who would say, that's not a bad place to work, right? Maybe we could go there and this is how the plantations run and this is where I would live and the country has art and culture. So it was sort of, an internal audience that these films were marketed to. Now, places like Leiden University would pick them up and say, my goodness, ethnography, we have the East right here in our auditoriums, and people would come from the public and watch these films. They were almost never shown in Indonesia, except if they were films of, healthcare related films about inoculation, about, against polio, things like that. So, yeah.
Sandeep, that answers a question that comes to us from Kirby Pringle, whether the films in question were exhibited in Jakarta or in Indonesia, and about any connection with the early cinema and movie theaters in Indonesia.
No, I mean, Lisabona and Thomas would know a lot more than I would about early cinema in Indonesia, like when Indonesians started making collaborative fictional films. Even before independence, but this sort of stuff was, I mean, you had people coming in now and then showing bits and pieces of film as attractions because anything on film was wow at a certain time. But these specific documentaries or propaganda films, whatever we call them, were not really meant for an Indonesian audience. I mean, I would imagine they were shown on the plantations and people come and watch them, or the one about Ria Rago was shown at the coronation because it was such a spectacle to show. How they showed it to 4,000 people, I don't know, Lisabona, but generally, no. It's very hard to find reference of these films. The Hajj film, though, was shown in movie theaters in Indonesia because the shipping companies and the government wanted Indonesians to pay to go on the Hajj. I mean, it was a huge business. So people would see that and say, well, let's go on a Hajj journey, right? the Hajis would then go. So yeah.
Friends, I'm afraid it's been quite a bit longer than an hour, which is where our time is up. But thank you very much, Lisabona, Thomas, of course, Sandeep, for talking about the book so generously and with such good spirit, everyone. That's it from us. I would like to remind our watchers, either now or on time delay, that we are offering a special discount if you'd like to buy the book. This discount will be valid for the month of September, so don't wait too long. And the discount code is coming on the crawler now. It's Ray20, and that will get you a 20% discount on the book for sales from our NUS Press website. But the book is also available on your major online. If you're not in Southeast Asia, you can order from the University of Chicago website or your favorite online bookseller. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ray20 that. Okay.